Hello, I'd like to welcome you to ICANN's webinar entitled 2013 RAA, Whois Accuracy Specification and the Registrar Data Directory Service, Whois Specification. Today's session will last for approximately 60 minutes, and our presenter is Caitlin Tubergen, Registrar Relations and Contracts Manager. Additional ICANN staff is also on hand to help answer any questions that are submitted by you via the Q&A pod, and will answer as many as time permits. Should we run out of time, or if you have additional questions after this session, please send them to raaquestions@icann.org. This session is being recorded, and links to the presentation materials will be delivered to the registrar mailing list following the webinar. Lastly, I'd like to remind you to mute your computer whilst I hand you over to Caitlin.
Hello, everyone. I'll begin the presentation by going over an agenda of today's webinar. First, I will go over an overview of the Whois accuracy specification and go over the difference between validation and verification of registered nameholders data. Next, we'll go over some Whois accuracy examples. Then we'll turn to the Registrar Data Directory Service specification, or the Whois specification, and discuss some of the new output fields and examples of that. Next, we'll go over the service level agreement that is detailed in the Whois specification. And last, we'll have a time for question and answer. If you would like a question addressed during the webinar, you are welcome to submit it to the Q&A pod. At the time the question is submitted, an ICANN staff member will acknowledge receipt of the question, and then the question will be viewable to all of the participants. So without further ado, I'll begin with the Whois accuracy specification. The Whois accuracy specification is mentioned in the transition addendum of the 2013 RAA, and it will be required as of January 1st, 2014. The Whois Accuracy Program specification requires the validation and verification of registration and account holder data in certain circumstances. Additionally, the 2013 RAA requires the deletion or suspension of domain name registrations in cases of willful provision of inaccurate or unreliable data, and that requirement is found in Section 3.7.7.2 of the agreement. The willful failure to update the data promptly, and that is found in Section 3.7.7.2 of the agreement, or the failure to respond to a registrar data accuracy inquiry within 15 days, and that requirement can be found in Section 4 of the Whois accuracy specification. Now we'll discuss Whois validation in more detail. So the Whois validation is essentially when the registrar will check to see if the information in the fields, the required fields, looks okay. And it's required within 15 days of the registration of a domain name, the transfer of a domain name, or a registrant or account holder data change. The required fields must be filled, and the required fields appear in Section 3.3.1 of the RAA and Section 1A of the Whois accuracy specification provides that all of the fields in 3.3.1 must be provided. Section 1B of the Whois accuracy specification defines how email addresses need to be formatted, and that's pursuant to RFC 5322. Section 1C of the Whois accuracy specification defines how telephone numbers have to be formatted, and that's in ITUT E.164. Section 1D specifies how postal addresses need to be formatted, and that's pursuant to UPU S42. And the cross-field validation is the one part of the Whois accuracy specification that will not be enforced by ICANN on January 1st, 2014. And the agreement specifies that this provision will not be required until there is mutual agreement between ICANN and the working group on cross-field validation. And this is mentioned in the transition addendum. So Whois verification is when the registrar is getting some sort of affirmative response from the registered name holder that the information is accurate. And Whois verification is required within 15 days of the registration of a domain name, transfer of a domain name, or the change of registrant or account holder data. The registrar has to verify the email address or telephone number further to Section 1F of the Whois accuracy spec. Within 15 days of an email bounce or other evidence of an inaccuracy, an email verification is required further to Section 4 of the Whois accuracy spec. The verification process requires an affirmative response from the registrant. Non-response by the registrant to the email or telephone verification requires either a manual verification by the registrar or suspension of the registration. Non-response by the account holder requires the registrar to perform the manual verification. So this slide shows examples of when Whois verification or validation would not be required. So it would not be required if the registrar had previously performed verification or validation on identical data, and the registrar has no reason to believe the data has become inaccurate or invalid. So if a registered name holder were to register a name and the registrar performed the appropriate verification and validation in the Whois accuracy specification, if the same registered name holder were to register a name 90 days later and provide the identical information, the registrar would not have to re-verify or re-validate the information unless it has reason to believe the data is inaccurate or invalid. And on the slide, it shows that an example of a reason to believe that the data is inaccurate, it could be a Whois inaccuracy complaint or an email bounce back. And that could be an email bounce back from, for example, a expiration reminder notice that registrars have to send further to the expired registration recovery policy. So I'll now go over some examples of Whois accuracy. If a registered name holder updates its postal address, the registrar must validate that the postal address is in the proper format, and the proper format is provided in Section 1D of the Whois accuracy specification. The registrar would not be required to re-verify the email address or the telephone number in Section 1F of the specification if they had already validated and verified this information previously. If a registered name holder updates its email address, the registrar needs to validate that the email address is in the proper format, and that format is specified in Section 1D of the Whois accuracy specification. The registrar must also verify that email address if the registrar previously verified the email address further to Section 1F1 of the Whois accuracy spec. If instead the registrar chose to verify the data via the telephone number, then the registrar would not have to re-verify the email address unless it had a reason to believe that it was inaccurate. If the registered name holder updates its telephone number, the registrar must validate that the telephone number is in the proper format, which is provided in Section 1C of the Whois accuracy specification. And the registrar must verify the telephone number if the registrar had verified this information through the telephone number, further to Section 1F2. If the registrar instead chose to verify the information via the email address in 1F1, then the registrar would not have to re-verify verify the telephone number. I'm not sure if he is in the room. He is, but James Bladel of the registrar stakeholder group had asked if he could share some examples with the group that might be helpful. So if he would like to present them at this time, we can unmute his phone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks,
I'm
James.
getting some echo now. I don't know where I'm getting that from. Thanks, Caitlin. And, I really didn't want to hijack your presentation or your slide deck, but I think this particular subject has created so much confusion. And I don't think that ICANN staff has really been plugged into just how much confusion there is right now in the industry and internally as registrars are struggling to deal with all the possible scenarios and permutations of when they have to verify something and when they have to, particularly what will trigger a re-verification and what sort of things ICANN is going to be checking for and, and presumably, and Maggie's on the call, presumably smacking our wrist if we get it wrong. So I think that it's good that registrars are having these conversations amongst themselves. I think now it's time to maybe expand that and include ICANN staff in some of those conversations. And so I wanted to share some examples that we've come up with to kind of, put out the idea that we're thinking about these as well and get some, something that lawyers don't like to get, which is prior approval that what we're thinking of is on the right track. So my question is, how can I get my bullet points? Can we load those into the presentation window, or do you want me to copy and paste them into the chat, or what do we want to do?
Could you copy and paste those into the chat, please, James?
I sure can, but I don't know if the formatting will be preserved. It looks like it won't. Let's try it. Ew, ugly. So, yeah, this is pretty ugly, and I think it's to the point where it's almost unusable.
James,
is there
James, can you just wait a moment? We're going to try to work on it at this end.
Sure, and that'll give me time, Tim, to put out a disclaimer that this is something that we have come up with internally through our discussions. It is not intended to be the only way or the right way to approach these problems. It is not being held out there as even the way that we at GoDaddy will ultimately solve some of these issues because we're still in internal discussions about some of our approaches and some of the logic that we're building in. So, but I think that these are common issues that all registrars are struggling with, and and I think it's important to have staff, in the room when we discuss these things, because if we're on the right track, we want ICANN to tell us that we're on the right track. But if we're on the wrong track, most definitely we want staff to say that they have a different approach to this. But it's important, I think, for the expectations to be synchronized. So while we get this junky little bullet point email up here, I will, once that comes up, I'll walk everyone through. And, okay. I'm still seeing the nothing is being shared window here. So I assume that means we're still upload in progress from Tim. So
Almost there.
okay, thanks, Tim. Back to nothing is being shared. Okay. Okay, thanks, Tim. Okay, so most of this probably, and apologize, this is fairly quick and dirty. Most of this, I think, lines up to what Caitlin was saying. I think it's key to get the registrars involved in this conversation so that this is not a a one-way lecture here. But here's the note that I've taken here, that we verify email or telephone number if these two situations occurred, which is as a shopper account, we call it shopper, account holder, customer, whatever your internal terminology is. But if it's a new account is created, or if a new email unknown to the registrar is provided for the registrant object, contact object in the Whois record. So you can choose which one of those would be verified. As far as triggers, we would re-verify the email or telephone if it's reported via ticket on the invalid Whois system, or an ICANN required email bounces as undeliverable. And we can detect this. Now, this is important because, first of all, we don't want to have to re-verify things if a marketing email or a coupon or some other sort of non-essential email comes back to us, because the registrant may have just simply identified those as spam. Secondly, we want to make sure that this is something that's coming back as undeliverable, and not necessarily that the email address is valid, but their mailbox is full, or their quota has been exceeded, or all of the other reasons you could get a bounce back other than invalid email address. And finally, there are some undeliverable situations where a registrar does not receive the bounce back address. So if they had no visibility to it, then of course they couldn't necessarily treat that as a report of inaccuracy. The second thing is the verified field that was provided by the registrant, the email or the telephone number, was modified by the registrant or updated, then that would trigger a re-verification. And then and I think Caitlin touched on this, if the registrant contact object is changed, its name or organization field is changed, that would trigger a re-verification, because now you're dealing with a new registrant entity. And then finally, if a domain name, and most registrars have some sort of a change of account or internal transfer process where a domain name moves from one registrant to another but does not, or one customer account to another but does not leave the registrar. If that transaction moves to a recipient account and that shopper account is unverified, then that would trigger a verification as well. So here's some things that the next section, I tried to outline some scenarios where the re-verification would not be required. For example, if the registration is in a shopper account that reuses data that's already been verified, you don't have to re-verify that. Inbound transfers, I know Caitlin mentioned that, but most registrars will send an FOA to an email with a confirmation code or a security code for the email address on file in Whois. And if that is reused at the new registrar following the transfer, then there's no need to verify that because it was verified during transfer. Any products or services that include two-factor authentication, for example, through SMS, would count as a verification because you actively confirmed the registrant is responsive at that telephone number by sending a code and having them re-enter it, for example. Any privacy or proxy service that substitutes its own email or telephone contact data would need to be verified once, and then that data would be considered verified for future registrations. Any email or telephone number used as part of an SSL certificate verification. Clearly, if someone has gone to the trouble to secure an SSL certificate for that domain name, then they should be considered verified. I have here that if you send the account holder a Whois data reminder policy notification or other action-oriented email and direct them back to your site to click on a token link, that would count as an email verification, and you could check that email as verified through that process. Another one would be any telephone contact with support or marketing or just other sort of customer relations. If you're calling on a domain name about your hosting service or other unrelated services about to expire, and you call the registrant and they answer that telephone number, well then as part of that process you have verified the telephone number. So I think all of those were just held out, and I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list, but there are scenarios there where you have verified the email or the telephone number, even if that wasn't your primary purpose for contacting the registrant. So I would recommend that registrars look for other ways to include verification as part of their existing communications with the customers. And what to do if verification fails, and I think there's been a lot of questions on this, and I'm going to ask ICANN to expand on what they mean by manual. Oops, I lost the screen. I think ICANN has said something about manual verification. I don't think it's clear what that means. If verification fails, it goes to manual. I'm not sure that that's what it means. And okay, now back to the slide. Are we done, or did we want to go back to?
We kind of ran out of that time slot, but we don't mean to take your slides off. We thought you were getting close to your finish. I'm sorry, James, but
I was very close, but that's okay.
Keep going. Just we'll remember what was up there.
Okay, well, just basically the consequences of something that failed, and I put a little quick and dirty truth table up there where if you have a shopper and a registrant verified, then the domain name is live and active in the root. If you have a shopper that is verified but the registrant verification fails, then you would take action against that particular domain that the registrant object is associated with. If you had a shopper that became unverified, but all of the registrant objects under that shopper were verified, then you would simply not allow that account to create new domain names. You wouldn't take action against those live domains. Now what we're thinking here is of a situation where a web designer has a single account with a registrar, and they have hundreds of customers, and all the customers are verified, but the web designer changes their phone number and doesn't verify it. We're not going to take hundreds of customers down in those situations. We will suspend the customer's ability to register new names, but I don't think you would expect us to take action against all of the sponsored names in that situation when their information remains valid. And then finally, if both are unverified, then you'd suspend the account and suspend the domain name. And suspend, I think, is another term that needs to be defined, but what we're calling it is suspend means we've taken control of the name and its DNS resolution away from the registrant, and we've moved it to some sort of an informational page that lets them know what's going on and how to fix it. And I don't think that's been clear. So that's really what I'm throwing out there to the group for discussion. I imagine that we'll continue these talks on our mailing list and possibly even future webinars. Thanks for the time.
James, this is Tim Cole. Thank you very much for providing those to us and to the others on the webinar. Of course, there are examples that we certainly want to take and look at because they come from you and other registrars that are actively in the business. And as I often said, I don't run a registrar, so I need to learn from you. But they don't necessarily carry ICANN's blessing at this moment. We certainly will look into it and see what we can respond with. But thank you very much. And I think you asked the question about what constitutes manual, and I think that's a fairly broad, it could be somebody coming in and showing you their identification. It could be something, a letter or something that happens that isn't necessarily automated, but I think it's not absolute as to what constitutes, but if you can provide proof should the question arise, that would be the important thing. I'm going to turn it back over to Caitlin now so that she can proceed with the rest of her presentation, and thank you very much, James.
Thank you, James and Tim. So we'll continue by looking at a different specification, which is the Registrar Data Directory Services, or Whois specification. So a few high-level points on the new Whois requirements. All of the requirements appear in the Registrar Data Directory Services specification. There are additional Whois output fields required now, all of which are specified in the specification. There is now uniform Whois query and output formats. The EPP statuses are now required. There is a service level agreement for Whois service, and that can be found in section 2.2 of the RDDS specification. IPv6 accessibility is now required, and port 43 Whois access is only required for thin registries, and that can be found in section 3.3.1 of the agreement. So the fields on this slide are required as of January 1st, 2014. There was an advisory issued on this in July, and a link to the advisory for those of you who have not seen it is included in the notes of the Adobe Connect room. So although these fields are not required until January 1st, they have to be in the registrar's Whois output, but they can be left blank until January 1st, 2014, and I wanted to be clear on that. We've noticed some common issues in the registrars under the 2013 agreement in terms of their Whois output, include extra fields or wording. The fields are out of order, required fields might be missing, or there's incorrect spacing. In other words, extra blank lines appear between fields or more than one space after the colon in the Whois field. And so just to be clear, the order of the Whois output fields that appears in the Registrar Data Directory Services or Whois specification is required for all registrars. And although there are certain fields that can be left blank until January 1st, the order is very important, and it's required to be in the order that is provided in the RDDS specification. So a couple of details about some of the new output fields. The registry domain ID is a field that does not change for the length of the registration. So once the registrar receives this ID from the registry, it will remain the same through the length of the registration. The registrar abuse, contact, email, and phone. I had a couple of registrars write in and ask which abuse contact they would need to put in those fields because some registrars have multiple abuse contacts for various services that they offer. And so we'll leave that up to the registrar, but I did want to note that the law enforcement contact that is contemplated in section 3.18.2 of the agreement that has to be monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and a response has to be given within 24 hours, that is not the contact that needs to be provided in these fields. The domain status, it's required to show EPP status codes in the domain status field. The registry registrant ID, the registry admin ID, and the registry tech ID may be left blank if they are not available from the registry. And a couple of registrars have written in and asked what needs to be shown in the output for the DNSSEC field, and so below I've included the two options that can be used for the DNSSEC field, and that's signed delegation or unsigned. So now we'll look at the service level agreement. This can be found in section 2 of the RDDS specification. There's a maximum monthly downtime of 864 minutes, a maximum round-trip query time of 4,000 milliseconds or 4 seconds for at least 95% of the queries. And just so you know, the time for registries, or in the registry agreement, is 2 seconds. So this is doubled for the registrar agreement. Updates have to be published within 1 hour of an EPP update to the registry for at least 95% of the probes. and the registrar cannot interfere with or provide preferential access to probes. So a couple of registrars have written in reference to the SLA time being 1 hour of EPP updates and brought it to our attention that there are certain EPP codes that registrars would not have access to. For example, the server set EPP statuses. So ICANN staff has been taking note of this, and we have a proposed interim solution that we wanted to provide to you. I'll go through it, and then if you have comments, you're welcome to submit them into the community chat. You're also welcome to take this in, think about it, talk amongst the registrar stakeholder group or the registrar mailing list, and get back to us at the RAAquestions@icann.org queue, and we will work together to issue an advisory about this issue that has been flagged. So this is particularly in reference to the domain status area of the Whois output. And so the registrar would be required to provide only registrar domain EPP statuses for the service level agreement. And this would prevent the registrar from querying the registry potentially every 60 minutes for the EPP status codes. The registrar would not be required to provide server set EPP statuses, so for example, server hold. However, registrars who choose not to display all EPP domain statuses would have to include a disclaimer in their Whois output. And within the Whois advisory, we would explain the location of where that disclaimer must be showed and a text defined in this future advisory that we would give. So this is a proposed interim solution to mitigate against this issue, to mitigate against the registrar having to potentially query the registry for the EPP domain statuses every 60 minutes. And so you're welcome to let us know your thoughts now or come back with them at a later date. So this concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A pod, and we will address them as they come in. I've also asked that the slides are unsynced now, so you're welcome to scroll back and revisit the slides.
Okay, to start the Q&A section, if customer is using a UPS box, do they need to include their USP box number in the address, or will the address of the USP store suffice?
This is Owen Smigelski. It has to be a valid postal address so that the contact is reachable, so they're contactable. If leaving off that UPS box means that mail will not get delivered to them, then that is not a valid contactable address. If it would get there, then yes, that could be. However, that would be something that the registrar would have to have documentation or evidence that it was contactable.
In regard to telephone support, if someone calls in to registrar support and we can see their caller ID, does that count?
It's not clear, this is Owen again, it's not clear what exactly you're asking about, whether does that count. If it's required that you have to do an email, a telephone verification, then that could count for that, but if you could just provide some additional information in the question pod so that we could respond to that, that would help. Thank you.
I'm not sure what this is referring to, but the question is, are these options part of the Whois RFC?
This is Francisco. It would be great if we can have clarity on what is meant. I'm not sure what these options is referring to.
Where exactly in the spec does it specify that the Whois output must follow a certain order?
This is Francisco again. I think that's outlined in section 1.4.2, where the response format is described. Each of the fields are expected to be in the order as are shown there with the field keys. That's the part to the left of the column to be exactly as is shown. Thank you.
What are the sanctions for service level expectations, SLA failures? Typically, these would be financial penalties, but how is this done in the RAA?
This is Owen Smigelski again. James, with this type of complaint, if we do receive it, it would follow the same 1, 2, 3 notice process the compliance uses for all other complaints relating to contracted parties. One of the things that we would expect with this additionally would be some type of root cause analysis of why the problem occurred and any short-term or long-term remediation actions that the registrar would take so that they would be able to achieve the SLA as required by the RAA.
ICANN, can we make sure that James's examples are included in the published version of these presentations post the meeting?
This is Tim Cole. And as I put in the chat, right now we're going to take his examples under advisement and review them. But at present, they don't. This is an ICANN webinar, and we are sponsoring the information we provide here, and we would be reluctant to provide something that might not be our position later on. So we are going to review it, and then we'll see what we can respond to with regard to his recommendations. I think they're very helpful for us to understand some of the concerns people have, but we're not ready to just distribute that list.
Should we specify the time in UTC, or can we put our local time?
Excuse me, this is Francisco. Since this is a global service, the intention is to have UTC shown there so that people have a uniform base to know the time. Thank you.
Does a domain suspension after failed verification require to disable renewal option for that particular user registrant?
This is Owen Smigelski. Yes, even if in suspension and that we're defining as a client hold, there is the ability for the registrant to renew that.
Okay, so the clarification from the question at the beginning, the two options for DNS sec field. Let me see what the question was.
Yeah, I think I can take that, Haley. So this is in reference to the previous question from James, I believe, regarding whether those options are part of the Whois RFC. So the answer is no. The Whois RFC is very, how can we say, very short and succinct, and it doesn't talk about any of the fields. It's just about the protocol, which is very simple. So the options for DNSSEC fields are part of the RAA, the RDDS specification.
When the review of James's slides be completed and date for distribution?
As soon as we can is really the answer right now. We are We were answering a lot of questions, and we'll put that in the queue with all of the others.
Tim, feel free to mark them as registrar recommendations, but not including them would be misleading. This is a comment from James Bladel.
We just don't want to engage in confusing people right now, because we recognize that some of the examples we don't find consistent with our interpretation. So before we issue something that we believe may be inaccurate, we're going to review it.
The spec says in 1.4.2, the format of responses shall contain all the elements and follow a semi-free text format outline. Note, contain all elements and semi-free text format, not contain all elements in the below order.
This is Francisco again. Yes, I understand that language. The interpretation, however, is that the intention there is that the fields are shown exactly in that order, so that we have a uniform output. And you can note that this is the same format that is required for the new ETLDs in Specification 4. The intention here is to have a uniform format for not just registers, but also with registries. Therefore, the order is important.
If we are verifying the telephone number of a registered name holder and the registrar is wanting to verify that the telephone number, can we verify it from the registrant calling us and we can see their caller ID, or do we need to call them?
This is Samantha Eisner. In the verification spec, it does specify that there are two methods or there's a method for verifying the account holder. But I would imagine, and Owen, you can weigh in here, if there is the ability to have documentation of a method of verification that was used that actually supported that the telephone number listed was the telephone number used, would that suffice for the compliance department?
This is Owen. Yes, that would be something, but it would have to be something that the registrar could document and be able to provide that verification did occur, that the registrant did call at such a date and time from that number, and it was logged and recorded in some manner.
Is it necessary to put a domain on client hold on failed verification? Can we instead modify the existing DNS to a page serving information indicating failed verification and recovery process?
This is Owen Smigelski again. The contract does provide several options that registrars can do. There's the suspension option, which does anticipate having name server changes. The concern is that the suspension does need to make sure that the domain is not in the DNS, so that email services are disrupted, web services are disrupted, and other services for that domain name are disrupted. If that can be accomplished through that, then that is something that would suffice for that.
We have less than 60 days to implement. Prioritization of James's example for review would be appreciated. please provide a date as to when you believe you'll be able to provide a formal response.
As we said before, we will do it as best we can. We realize everyone's under tight deadlines, as are we. So we will come out with some additional information, plus we're going to be providing an FAQ for a lot of the most common questions or the most difficult questions that we have received through RAA questions at ICANN.org. So please understand that we are aware of the time frame, and we are doing the best we can to provide information that will be helpful. And that would include James's materials, which we received at 6 o'clock this morning. So we really haven't had time to review it, but we certainly will do so as soon as we can.
When will the FAQ be available?
This is Caitlin Chebergen. The FAQ will be available on the ICANN website at, prior to right before the Buenos Aires meeting, so approximately mid-November.
There are currently no more questions.
Seeing as there are no more questions, we will now conclude this webinar. We wanted to thank everyone for their participation. Again, if you have any follow-up questions or comments, you're welcome to submit them to the RAA questions at ICANN.org email. This presentation was recorded, and a link to the slides and a recording of the presentation will be distributed to the registrar mailing list shortly following the webinar. Thank you again for your participation.